because we've definitely filled this place up today. My name's Richard Campbell. You may have seen me earlier today. And I make a lot of podcasts. So any .NET Rocks listeners in the room? I know I talked to a couple already. So my friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002, which means it predates the word podcast by 2 years. We call it an internet audio talk show because we're not clever enough to come up with the word podcast. And we've been making at least a show a week ever since, some kind of luminary in the industry. A bunch of the speakers you'll see here over the next 2 days have been on the show before. And I've also been making a sysadmin podcast that I started in 2007 because Vista seemed like a good idea. And that's once a week, so more over 1,000 episodes on that as well. The tablet show was a brief period from 2011 to 2014 where I wasn't sure if .NET rocked anymore. It was a tough time. And we were kind of not really sure where mobile and tablet development were going to live, so we made a separate show for that. And then after a few years, it was like, oh, clearly .NET rocks, so that's fine. We'll roll it into the main show. But back in about 2011, my friend Carl, the creator of .NET Rocks, encouraged me to make some shows about geekier subjects, stuff that the audience liked, space topics, alternative energy, and things like that. We called them the Geek Outs. There's about 100 of them now. And for a while there, I was making one almost every month. But now we're down to a couple a year, typically around Christmas time when you want to decompress anyway. I'll recap sort of the state of space, what we've done in the past year and what we can look forward to, and energy generation. We're slowly decarbonizing energy generation, and so it's interesting to see the evolutions of all of that. These have led to some interesting opportunities for me. That one at the top there, the Moon-Based Geek Out, was taken from a European Space Agency paper that I read about a real serious proposal to build a base on the south pole of the moon and to use it sort of like Antarctic laboratory where we'd be putting astronauts up there for about 42 days at a time, and they had a set of science experiments, things to do, and so on. So I thought that was interesting, did some additional research, pulled all those pieces together, and made an hour-long podcast on it. And then a few months later, NASA called, which is a pretty good day. Like, really? And let's be clear, they emailed first. And I was suspicious because it looks like spam to me, right? Like I get all kinds of cool email. But this one really was a nasa.gov. And like, we'd really like to talk to you. I finally get to get on the phone, and he's like, hey, we really like your podcast. I'm like, cool, NASA listens to my podcast. That's pretty interesting. He's like, would you ever consider doing it as a talk? I'm like, sure, okay. Like, they don't know what I do. They think I'm a podcaster, right? It's like, do you know how to use PowerPoint? Because we really like PowerPoint at NASA. I'm like, yeah, I bet you do. Okay. It's like, well, we'd love if you come down and give a talk on the moon-based stuff. It's like, wait, to who? Well, to us. I'm like, NASA? Yeah. You know it's your stuff, right? Yeah. So you want me to present your stuff to you with PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay. So I got to go down to NASA Ames, and then my name up on the big board as I came onto the facility. I took a picture of that. My mom's proud. And got to talk to a bunch of the scientists and stuff about my thoughts, based on their thoughts, of what we could build on the moon. And yeah, it was a great experience and a lot of fun. That being said, this talk on undersea infrastructure has never been made a geek out. It's the first time. After I did that NASA thing, then the conferences found out that I'd done this for NASA. I'm like, well, why won't you do a space talk for us? I'm like, why do you want a space talk? I'm like, we want a space talk. Okay, I'll do a space talk. And that turned into energy talks and nuclear power talks. And this is one that was asked for. I've always been interested in the undersea cable system. Like, could you talk a bit about it? Now, I'm very fortunate that some of the work I've done over the years, I've worked closely with companies that are doing distributed computing. And so this undersea cable map has been sort of a useful tool for me to understand how we connect different countries together, what that even looks like. But you start to care about latency, right? We're doing data entry in Cayman to a virtual machine set sitting in the Bahamas that actually stores data in Liechtenstein. And so where those cables go kind of matters in that equation. So that was an interesting project. But actually putting together an hour to really talk about this, you learn a lot more. Really, you got to start at the beginning. So the origins of this is electricity. So you think about the late 1700s, early 1800s, we're starting to build dynamos and really, electromagnetism played for a while, but we're starting to turn it into a product. And as soon as you got it transmitting over wires of any kind, they say, hey, can we stick it under the ocean? Because that seems like a good idea. And if you go to this museum in England, they have a piece of one of the very first undersea electrical cables. This is from 1845, run between England and France. Now, it didn't go well. It took them a few tries to lay a cable like that. They didn't last for very long because the tech was pretty primitive. They were coating it in gutta percha, and they destroy pretty quickly. But this is literally in a couple of decades of Faraday making the first electric motors. They're already starting to use electricity. And that's right around the same time that the telegraph emerges, which is essentially pulses of electricity. So they turn it into a telegraph line between England and France. So instead of having to sail a ship between the two countries to transmit a letter, now you can do it by telegraph. And so that becomes a big business. Can we actually span oceans with this? And this is a map of the telegraph connections around the planet from 1901. So in a matter of 30 or 40 years, we were running cables everywhere across it. The first really operational one, they started in the 1850s, but it's not until 1866 they get, by the third try, the first really reliable transatlantic cable. And the pitch line in the newspaper was from 2 weeks to 2 minutes. I mean, we take for granted that we can pick this thing up and call just about anybody anywhere in the world at any time. And this was just an impossibility. In 1860, if I wanted to get a message to you in England while I was in New York, it took 2 weeks. I wrote the letter, and I put it on a ship, and it traveled across. You read it, hopefully responded, and then it's another 2 weeks to get back. Like, that's some bad ping time. And now it was a couple of minutes. It was expensive, but it was fast. And so the world gets a little smaller, right? We sort of transform things at that moment. And by the point that this cable network is this big, this is 1901, this is when Marconi does his first wireless transmission across the Atlantic again. So we're just getting radio to that possibility in that level of communication. We don't even have telephone yet, really. We're still at the beginning of all that. All right, so the telegraph and electrical connections come first. The next area that emerges is actually in the oil industry. You might be familiar. We had found offshore oil pretty early on. I mean, really, oil discoveries only start in the early 1900s. And pretty quickly we find out that short distance offshore, you can find some oil down there. And so we build piers out to it and drill down and pump it ashore. But as you get further out, pipe works get a little more complicated. But the real driver for undersea pull was World War II. It was D-Day. In the math of figuring out D-Day, they figured out that 60% of the total mass that was going to need to move from England to France for the invasion, 60% of it was petroleum, oil, and lubricants. And so there was a whole idea of like, we can't ship that much stuff. That's a lot of ships. What if we laid pipes? And so they took these old freighters and they built flexible piping they could stack on them and laid pipes under the English Channel to pump those fluids around. And they ended up moving about 50% or 60% of all of the fluids needed for the entire invasion moved across those pipelines in that duration. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 billion gallons of fluids moved. And it worked so well under the strait that they continued the pipelines as the invasion pushed the Germans back. Now, all of this was removed at the end of the war because the steel was so valuable at the time. But it was one of the first real pushes on large-scale piping, pumping, undersea solutions for the war, and a bigger factor than most of us ever heard about. That this system, they were all named for these Disney characters. This was the Operation Pluto. And they, had silly names. The pipeline in the north was called Bambi, and the pipeline in the south was called Dumbo. Excellent. After the war, we got more serious about offshore drilling, and in the Gulf of Mexico in the 1950s, they start to build an oil derrick that can actually sitting on a barge and can be moved around. This one was called Mr. Charlie, and it was good out to about 15 meters of water. So it's still early days, and then the Gulf of Mexico is very shallow. Oh wait, sorry, the Gulf of America? Let's stick with the Gulf of Mexico, actually. But this becomes a catalyst for more technological development, mostly working on the seafloor, initially with divers and eventually with ROVs. And today we have, and again, if we're in Norway, you may be familiar, we have infield pipeline systems that interconnect between different wellheads. Then you have export pipelines because they're long and more expensive that actually transmit up the surface. They can also go to buoy to do loading. We learned very early on not to allow ships to come near rigs because that water's mean. Everything bad happens, so you keep things apart. It's easier to do floating pieces than that, or to actually pump all the way to shore. So, and these are bidirectional. You're also pumping water into the wellheads as well, so you'll have sets of pipes that are moving that around. These pipes tend to be relatively large, 15 to 80 centimeters across, coated in concrete, and then largely they sit on the bottom. The bottom type matters a lot. We don't like rocky bottoms. They abrade and damage the pipes. You want it to seat partly in the sand or the silt. You don't want it to sink too far, although that's also a problem. Maintaining these pipelines is challenging. They're under a lot of pressure. But foundationally, most of this was figured out in the 60s and 70s. But much of the technology that has advanced since then for undersea infrastructure as a whole starts with the oil industry. The oil industry was very motivated to mature a lot of these technologies. The methods of laying, which we'll get into, and maintaining and so forth, they come much of it from the oil industry. By the late 1950s, there's now a proposal to start taking telephone across the Atlantic as well. And so this is in 1955, what they call the TAT-1, or the transatlantic telephone cable run across between US, Canada to the UK. The original cable ran from 1956 to 1978. It could handle an entire 35 phone calls at once. And it ran about $12 for a 3-minute call. Today, that'd be about $100 a call for the first 3 minutes. Cable's relatively simple. It is a set of copper cables in a copper sheath with series of different coatings and protections on it. The outer copper is actually the power transmitter, because part of the problem with these long cables, you're talking about a 6,000 kilometer long cable, is you need to amplify it on a routine basis. So you're also transmitting a fair bit of DC electricity through that cable to operate the boosters for each of the signals. So there's multiple strands inside that inner core that are actually being boosted with these repeaters that are laid. In the TAT-1, it was roughly every 70 kilometers, so there was about 50-odd repeaters across the entire line. And this was the complicated bit, was how do we take in those signals, boost them up, and send them on again without too much latency. And they have built, since TAT-1, I think they're up to TAT-14 now, before technology changes again, because it does, obviously. These are the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s we'll get the transformation with fiber optic cable, because this new network is much denser. Now when the internet public and so forth, we have about 1,700 of these cables worldwide. They represent 97% of all data traffic that'll move around. Like, we're very excited about these satellite networks. We may not be too excited about the guy, but he's put up 7,000 satellites, right? That's twice as many satellites as all the other satellites combined. And it's a fairly effective system, and it moves 1% of internet data. It's not a backbone, right? The density is just not even vaguely comparable. The current satellites they're using, they call the V2 minis, are about 60 gigabits each total bandwidth capacity. So, even with all of them combined, it's about 420 terabits. A current generation undersea fiber optic cable is 480 terabits. One. So you're going to need a lot more satellites than this, or we're going to have to increase densities. Like, the problem with, and this is why wireless didn't take over for wired in the first place, is that you only have so much bandwidth. You only have so much air transmission space. You can pack a lot more data, mostly because of this stuff, the glass fiber. As we learn to make glass fibers and we learn to make lasers, we were able to densify data in totally new ways. It's no longer pulses of electricity. It's modulations of light, and the density is unbelievably high. The creation of fiber is kind of a crazy business. It's a series of different layers. So in the very center of that fiber core is a glass core with a cladding around it that increases reflectivity, because we're just trying to keep all the light in. Yes, I know how fast the speed of light is, but that's in a straight line, and there's nothing straight in a fiber optic cable. It bounces around, it attenuates, it loses frequencies. These outer coatings are all different forms of protection and restrictions to limit the rate of bend, because if you bend it too far, it will break, right? They're relatively fragile things. They're made in different sizes depending on what you do with it. The typical single mode fibers are very narrow, so 9 micrometers is much thinner than a human hair. 50, which would be your multimodal, is about half the width of a human hair. The total width of a finished cable is about 1.5 millimeters, maybe 2 millimeters, depending on the coating. And this all comes down to the visible spectrum. Different lasers have different wavelengths. We have better quality lasers at certain wavelengths than others. The shorter wavelengths in high frequency bounce more, lower frequencies bounce less. You can use a mixture of frequencies in a multimodal cable to pack more data in. So that's what we do today, is we have an array of different lasers at different frequency sets, all bouncing inside of the same cable at the same time. Now, to make the cable, you start with what's called a preform, or a billet, which is basically a cylinder of glass, of silica. They're fairly big, maybe 1 meter, 2 meters long, and about 3.5 meter wide. You'll hollow it out, and then you'll spray different films on the inside to coat it to maximize its reflectivity. And then you'll melt it in a crucible. So you're going to heat this preform up, and it's literally going to drip out the bottom of the crucible and be drawn into the fiber. Well, that takes a while, and so you drip it off of a tower 50 to 60 meters high. And along the way, you have various sensors and adjusters to draw the fiber down to the capstan. By the time it gets to the bottom of this, it's no longer molten, it's cooled. And you spin it onto a capstan. And when you finish the entire draw, then you test it to find out what you made. Because you're never sure. You've mixed different compounds together, but humidity matters, temperature matters. There's enough different forces that literally they have to test cable by cable. And when you're going to lay an undersea cable, you're going to use a bunch of these. You're going to have specific specifications. And so they're going to make a lot of cable to get to the ones that you want, depending on your quality requirements. Typically, to make a 10,000 kilometer cable, and that's long, but not the longest cables. We're laying 30,000s these days. Take about a week to make one. You're going to need a few. There's different styles of cladding. This is sort of the traditional for, really would be an onshore, or what they call a rigid or tight buffered cable. We also make loose buffered cables, especially when you're going to go underwater. You want to separate them out into sort of a floating matrix of gel that's water repellent, as well as gives more flexibility. These cables are going to go through a lot while they're under the water. They're going to be involved in landslides and other events that are going to move things around and put a lot of pressure on them. And so you want to give them a little more flexibility and different coatings on them. That being said, they're still pretty small. This picture was just a good-looking picture of the breakdown, but this is a 48. You wouldn't lay this much fiber at once. You can't get enough repeaters for it. Most undersea cables these days are 12s or 24s. But you'll armor them at different levels. So the least armor is on the right here. This is about the size of a garden hose, like 20 millimeters across. So that's got all the fibers in the center of it. And you can see the copper cores in between, and that copper is the power transmission wrapped around it. You still have to send electricity down because we still need repeaters, as well as the fibers carrying the data itself. And then we have different levels of armoring, and that depends on the risk to the cable. What kind of bottom is it sitting on? Right? Rocky bottoms are going to abrade the casing, and so we'll want to have layers of steel on it. Is there a risk of it being dragged or damaged? It's typically close to shore, you'll have more armoring. And in fact, any given cable for a lay like this will have different armoring at different points. Once you're into the deep ocean, you probably don't need to armor unless you're dealing with the mid-Atlantic ridge or things like that. You'll try and lighten it up because these lightweight cables are running somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 kilos per kilometer. But a double armored like that is more like 1.5 metric tons per kilometer. And you're laying a 10,000 kilometer cable. So that gets heavy and it takes up a lot of room. And so in a given cable, they will vary the armoring based on the plan they have. And then at regular intervals, they're going to put these repeaters in. Now, these are optical repeaters now. We're taking the laser light out of the fiber optic cable. We're splitting it back out again. We're pumping it up, strengthening that signal with this DC power that's also transmitted with it, and then reintegrating it back in the fiber and back out again. And again, on a routine basis, every 50 to 100 kilometers, you're going to have one of these. And the cable itself will be pre-made with the repeaters integrated into it. And then it's poured or pulled into a big barrel, typically of a ship. and wound layer by layer, and wherever they, after that 100 kilometers or so, when the repeater comes up, they'll put that repeater into a carriage rack, steps out of the drum, and then they step back into the drum and continue to wind for another 100 kilometers, and then the next repeater and the next repeater for as long as the cable may be. Now, that's data cabling. You'll see similar cable designs, especially around wind power, but the cores will be different. Now we have much larger copper conductors. Still a fiber optic cable for data signaling, but now you're taking the three-phase generator off of a wind turbine and trying to transmit that electricity, so you need three big copper cores to move that power. And these days, modern wind turbines get up into the megawatts at full bore. So these are beefy, expensive, dangerous cables. Do not touch to tongue. These days, this is actually a picture of true floating offshore wind turbines. We largely don't do this. This is still experimental to actually have floating wind turbines. There's some experiments in the North Sea. There's some experiments going on down closer to Spain. The vast majority of offshore wind turbines are anchored in the bottom, so they're typically limited to 50 meters of water. And the normal way, ask the Danes, they've done it a bunch, but they put down a casement, drain all the water out of it, drill a big hole in the ground, pour a bunch of concrete, stick the mast in, wire it up, pull the casement out, water comes back, you're good to go, making electricity when it's windy. And then you have to hook it up. It needs to be wired. And so there's cables running from every single one of those. Sometimes they're integrated together and they do synchronization out at sea, but most of the time they just run those wires to shore and do the work from there. Okay. And there are other power connectors. In fact, Norway and Denmark have a couple of really great high voltage DC power connectors that allow them to share power in both directions. When the Danes' wind turbines are really humming, Norway turns down their hydroelectric power and uses the excess wind power, which can't be stored effectively. Although you guys do that by taking that excess electricity and pumping the water back uphill, which is a cool trick, right? You run the dam backwards. But then when the wind's not blowing and the Danes are low on power, you open the dams up again and run more power, and that same cable pumps the electricity the other way, and it's just a bunch of arbitrage. And those high voltage DC cables run under the Baltic Sea, and you thought this thing was dangerous. Those should not be messed with. They are very high voltage, in the hundreds of thousands of volts, but they transmit electricity really reliably, and they don't require the grids to be synchronized together, and they're completely bidirectional. So part of being great neighbors and making a better power grid has been being able to share power between these systems with this undersea infrastructure. All right, let's go back to data. I want to walk through an example of a cable, and it's sort of a modern description of what cables are like. So this is the cable run by Google. It's called the Donant cable. It was run in 2020. It took them less than a year to lay it, which is very efficient, productive cable. This is a 250 terabyte cable, a terabit cable, 12 fibers in it. So first step is they negotiate the agreement. We're going to run a 6,600 kilometer cable between Virginia and the United States and on to France in a place called Saint-Hilaire. So once you get an agreement with the ISPs that are actually going to pick up the connections once you get them out of the ocean, and you get the governments to agree that you're allowed to dig up some of their beach and run in their operating area, then you're going to hire a specialist company to produce the cable and then actually install it. So we talked a little bit about how these fiber optic cables are made. This is a 6,600 kilometer cable, so it can be done in a single pull. Longer cables that will have multiple ships that will meet up in the ocean, which is a cool trick. But these ships, there's less than 100 of them in the world, and they are dedicated to the process of laying down these kinds of fibers. This is the CS Reliant by Subcon, with the one that actually laid the Donant cable. These are very sophisticated machines. They have normal engines on them, but they also have precision holding engines. They can keep themselves within a meter of a track for weeks at a time. It's called dynamic positioning. So there's not a whole lot of steering going on. The computer takes over and drives the ship. So the main part of the lay at high speed is laying about 10 kilometers per hour, so roughly 6 knots. So that's when they're in the deep water and they can work their way across. That means every 10 hours or so, because the repeaters are every 100 kilometers, they're going to have a repeater go off, which takes a little more work, comes out of the carriage, goes over the lift, and then off the side and into the water. And believe me, this is the easy part of that. Now, that being said, You do the math here, laying down 10 kilometers per hour means it was 660 hours to lay this cable. It's actually longer than that. And you can get into situations where while these ships are tough, hurricanes are tougher. And so there are times where they can abandon the cable, and they won't actually abandon it. They'll either mount a buoy to it, or they'll simply cut it and drop it over the side and go pick it up again later. Get the ship out of the way to keep it safe, let the storm go by, and then come back. They'll use their ROV to find the cable, hoist it back up, re-splice it, and continue. And I'll talk about finding and splicing when we get into the repairs part. The complicated part of cables is towards the shore, because shores are hostile. They're dangerous bits. And so they have these sledges that allow them to bury the cable in the seafloor as they go. These are large machines, and traditionally they buried about 1 meter below. These days, because of incidents, they've been burying as deep as 4 meters to try and get them below most of the action. That means you have to have a bottom that's buriable. And it's a much, much slower process. Now we're talking less than 1 knot to drag a plow to put the cable under. The way this actually works is they start with what is called the beach manhole. So you dig up the beach, you dig a trench to the ocean, you pour a bunch of concrete. This is the termination of the wet side. While the top is off, they hook up a big winch on the far side. The ship comes up with the end of the cable. They hook that cable in, drag it in here, anchor it off. Then they run the sledge up to it, and then they pull the sledge back out to bury the cable into the beach and then under the bottom very slowly out until they get to deep enough water. Typically, they want to get at least 200 meters deep before they'll stop burying, sometimes more. It depends on the area. Inside the beach manhole, if you ever get a look at it, it will be boring and disappointing. It's a concrete box with a cable coming in from one side and a cable from the other side and a splice integrator. So this is when we talk about going from the wet side to the dry side. This is all about multiplexed fiber right now. We're not trying to fix the signals. There's no IP addresses here yet. We're not doing any of that. It's not until we actually get onto the land side that we start to break these things out. So there's going to be another building called the cable landing station where that connecting dry side fiber comes in on the roof and comes down. The little blue box in the middle here, that is your multiplexer, turning it into IP and connecting it up to the rest of the internet. Everything else you see around it is power. We're pumping a lot of electricity into that cable to be able to power all those repeaters. We also have all the test equipment. We have ways of sending down the signals to figure out where there might be breaks in it. We're monitoring rate of transmission and controls. These are not huge rooms. They're very nondescript brick buildings relatively close to a beach that nobody wants to talk about, because we prefer you never ever go there. These things run better when left alone. Now, let's talk about the hard part. Sometimes bad things happen. Cables get damaged. They get torn. Why? Well, there are the natural occurrences. So especially when you're running across the Atlantic, you have the mid-Atlantic ridge. That is literally a crack on the planet where the ocean is getting bigger. It's being pushed apart. Now, when they're planning a route, they'll map all this out in detail, and they'll pick a part of the trench that's less disruptive. Sometimes they'll decide they have to armor across that ridge, because they do have landslides and volcanoes and things, which can be hard on the cable. Even coming up the continental slope, you have steeper slopes that are more likely to slide. You'll try and stay away from those. So they pick the path very carefully. It sets the price of the cable and so forth. But as we get closer to shore, now we deal with human interactions. Trawlers, right? Some of them even are involving fish, and of course anchor drags. On average, year over year, with a few notable exception years, there's 100 to 200 cable faults per year. So dozens per month. It's normal. Most of them are minor. Some of them are not. There are specialist ships for repairing cables. If you're going to do a deep water repair, so you have a break somewhere near the fault line, something like that, you'll send a dedicated ship out to do this. This is the Intrepid. And you'll see it has a front loader, it also has a back loader, and they manage to find the damaged cable. So this is a fairly complicated process. You know roughly where the break is, because you're able to do modulation down the fiber optic cable. You know how long it took to get there and back. And so that gives you an estimate within a few kilometers of where the break might be. You'll then send the ship out roughly to that area. you'll put down a magnetic transponder, and then you'll start to do pulses of electricity through the cable, because that gives you much more of a precise location. And that'll get you closer to where the break might be. And then you're going to lay down an ROV, big tractor, size of an SUV. You're going to put it down on a crane on the bottom, and you're going to hunt the cable down and try and find the location of the break. Sometimes they've been buried by landslides. This can take a while. All right, but you're looking for the problem. We'll talk about what they do next. Closer to shore, you won't use a ship like this. These are expensive, and you don't need a lot of the features. You'll use a barge. So this is Neptune's Marine's repair barge. Same basic setup, though. Big derrick, ROVs, splice boxes. They'll maneuver these relatively close to shore. It's not that hard to find the cable. They know roughly where it is. And then they'll use impellers to keep the barge exactly in place while they're doing this work. So over the side goes this ROV to locate the cable. And this is capable of doing some repairs, laying splice elements in, doing taps and so forth. But usually if the damage is as bad as that earlier picture where we've had a drag and it's actually torn the cable, you have to bring the cable up to do splicing. And so that's another part of the ROV's job. Typically what it'll do is it'll clear the entire cable, figure out where the break is, maybe there's more than one, and at the simplest level, they'll cut ahead of the break and well behind the break, and then they'll hook up a float or a joiner onto the cut and then use the crane to lift that piece up. If the cable's in good enough shape they don't actually want to cut it apart, they'll actually put a bar on, and they'll mount that bar to either side of the cut. This is all done by an ROV. Like, this is a cool job. And these days with Starlink, half the time those ROV operators aren't even on the boat. They're at home playing a video game in the ocean. And then they'll use that arm to lift the entire cable up. Well, this is already a patched cable, but you get the idea. That box on the left side there, that's a splice room. So after the damaged cable is lifted, it's pulled into the splice room. If it's done in two parts, they'll pull both sides into the splice room. And then the splicers go to work. So they cut away all the damaged cable, they open the entire thing up, they spread out the fibers, they put it into a rack, they take this patching assembly. Sometimes they'll add additional cable as well if they need to. They usually want to leave a bunch of slack where this happened, so they'll add another kilometer or so cable into that. They'll do all the patching, package the whole thing up, then it's lifted back out of the splice room on an armature, and then put back over the side again. Cool, huh? It's an interesting job. Again, a rare job. The waiting time typically to get a cable break worked on now is 3 to 6 months. These ships are working all of the time. There's only so many of them. They're expensive to run. You need to keep them busy. So where do we have the problems? Well, we typically have them in the focal points of the undersea cable. And there's certain places in the world where there's just more cables running through. One of them is in the Eastern Mediterranean going through the Red Sea, the Suez Canal. If you want to run a cable from Europe to Southeast Asia, you could go around the African continent, but that is the long way. And so the quicker way is to cut through the Red Sea, and the byproduct is a huge number of cables run through here. That's about 17% of all internet traffic travel through this particular corridor. So it's a busy corridor, and some of the longest cables in the world are run through there. Now, Egypt seems to be relatively stable these days. It's just a happy, army-controlled dictatorship. Happy. Things would get interesting if we got into a situation like we had in the 1950s with the Suez Canal crisis, but so far so good. One of the very longest cables in the world, called the SEMEWE3 cable, so that's Southeast Asia, Mediterranean, Western Europe, cable number 3, which is 39,000 kilometers long, was a double splice. So they ran one ship from one end, another ship from the other end, and then they had ships meet them in between, join up, and then meet up again. Splice that whole cable together. And I mentioned this particular cable because in September it got damaged in an anchor drag in Port Said, which is just outside of the Suez Canal. And this was the message from Azure warning that bandwidth would be impacted. If you were, say, a Cosmos DB consumer, and you're trying to synchronize Cosmos nodes between Europe and Southeast Asia, path matters, latency matters, and losing that high-speed cable has an impact on that. Now, good news is it was a shoreside fix. They were able to use the barges. They got to it relatively quickly. We're expecting to be operational at any time. But we have a lot of cables under the water, and we use them. We could still use more, and more are being laid all the time. Another great focal point is Southeast Asia. So this is the Malaysian Peninsula, the Straits of Malacca, going up into the South China Sea. Lots of cables run through here. Very, very busy spot. Singapore is a major landing point. That's that little focus, all those yellow dots that are landing sites, because it's the turning point on the southern edge of the Southeast Asian continent. And so often they land there. There's lots of data there. Singapore is an advanced society. It's also a huge harbor point. And you get into situations like 2008, 2009, there was a bit of an economic downturn. Maybe you remember. And so the demand for cargo went down dramatically. Now, if you own a cargo ship and there's not a lot of work for you to do, you need to park it somewhere. And parking for cargo ships is hard to come by. But there's also, and expensive, but there's also the laws of the sea. And the laws of the sea say that an abandoned ship needs to go through a process before it can be recovered. It takes 2 to 3 years. So you figure you haven't got a lot of work for a year, you find a place to anchor, maybe off the edge of the Strait of Malacca there. Your crew goes out on by boat secretly in the night, and you got about 1.5 years, 2 years before you're really going to have any problems. So if business picks back up, you send the team back out, pick up the boat, and go again. Problem is, you anchored too close to some cables, and there was a typhoon 3 or 4 months later, and the ship got dragged a bit, and it damaged the cable. And so in 2008, 2009, we had a ton of damage, and all that cables through that corridor, mostly due to abandoned cargo ships. And it took years to clean it all up. But we're in Norway. Let's talk about the Baltic Sea. Actually, let's not even start with the Baltic Sea. Let's talk about the North Sea. Because long before the fun and games of 2024, there was a series of incidents off the west coast of Norway involving some research cables and the cable running to Svalbard that looked like trawler drags until they spent some time actually analyzing the data, the AIS maps of the ships, of the boat's behavior, and realized, hey, this trawler drove back and forth over where that cable was 140 times. Do you think it was an accident? NATO has basically said now those were military training exercises. That these were Russian trawlers, and they were not really fishing for anything. And the main thing that the Russians learned is that trawlers are lousy at picking up cables, which is by 2024, they changed tactics. But before that, we had this little bubble in the ocean. In 22, a few months after the hot war in Ukraine started, I would argue the Cold War started in 2014 with little green men, but things got really hairy in February of 22. There was a set of mysterious explosions over a less than 24-hour period that ruptured all 4 of the Nord Stream pipes. Now, Nord Stream 2 had been built, but had never actually been used, but was fully pressurized with gas. Nord Stream 1 had been in use, but as soon as the war started, Germany turned off the pipes. They weren't going to take the gas anymore. And there was a big argument over what was supposed to be done there. The Russians had the problem, they'd been pulled out of the world banking system, so they couldn't use euros anyway. And so there's a big debate is exactly why these pipes mysteriously exploded when they did. They've been inspected. There was bubbling gas coming out of this. That was not because gas was flowing, it's because the lines are pressurized with gas. Keeping natural gas in them keeps them more intact. They take less damage that way, so it's a safety thing. The same reason you tend to keep fuel tanks full on aircraft and so forth. They're safer full than they are empty. So what we saw coming out of there, which drained out in a day or two, was just the pressurization lines of there. There was an awful lot of evidence pointing to a crack Ukraine team doing this. They even arrested a couple of them, but it seems like it was a false flag action, probably by the Russians. Apparently the Swedes know. They tracked the ship that did it. They're just not talking. A couple years later, in 2024, we have the Yiping 3 incident. This is a Chinese bulk carrier left out of Russia, loaded with fertilizer, and in November, passed by the island of Gotland and cut the BCS, the east-west cable, and then shortly after that, cut the Sea Lion cable. So that was roughly the track. It meant it then stopped. There was a time when it turned off its tracking, then it turned it back on, and then a Danish public broadcaster rented a drone, flew it out to the ship, and noticed that one of the anchors was mangled, and that sort of kicked off an investigation. There was negotiating with the Chinese, not surprising, and the Danes and the Swedes and the Chinese and a few others all got to inspect the ship, talk to the crew, and then they let them go on their way, called it an accident. Now, listen, these are really big ships. These anchors are a couple of $100,000. They are not cheap. They have multiple safety systems to keep them in place. Now, the ships do drive on autopilot. So one of the arguments was one of our anchors accidentally went down, and he slowed the ship down, but the autopilot just turned up the engines and countered the drag, and it scraped along the bottom for 150 kilometers, which seems unlikely. Anyway, so the Chinese got to go about their business, and then a few weeks later, it happened again with the oil tanker Eagle S. Now this time they ripped a power cable, the S-Link 2 cable, and 2 different data cables owned by Eliza that go to Finland. I don't know if you've met any Finns. They don't have a lot of sense of humor about just about anything, really. I'm reminded of the joke of a Finn and a Swede drinking together, and the Swede says, "Skål," and the Finn says, "Are we going to drink or are we going to talk?" So the Finns seize the ship. They don't mess around. They board the ship with an armed crew. They take control of the ship. They pull it in. The Eagle S is missing an anchor. It is flatly gone. There's just a dangling chain where it used to be. So the Finns get a submarine, and they go find the anchor. This is the anchor. It's supposed to look like this. See the long tines? They're gone. Again, a drag of over 100 kilometers to rip through those cables. Now, the difference is that the Finns utilized a new UN marine law to seize the cargo to pay for the damages. 35,000 tons of unleaded gasoline being sold on the gray market through the shadow fleet. That apparently made an impression on some folks, because the next time it happened, it was the Vensen who dragged a cable across the Latvian-Sweden cable, and this time the Swedish Navy came out, seized the ship, charged the crew, took the cargo to pay for the repairs. Each of those repairs, the data cables took about 4 months. The power cable that was cut between Estonia and Finn took almost a year. They're expensive and difficult repairs, especially power. It's not an easy thing to do. All of these incidents were considered accidents, except that after you seize 2 cargo sets, not been another one since. It's been a year and a half. The other thing that's happened is that NATO, which now includes Sweden and the Finns as well, has put on a thing called Baltic Sentry. And Baltic Sentry is a set of small ships, aircraft, and drones that photographs and tracks every single cargo ship moving in the Baltic Sea. You drop an anchor, they'll know within an hour. And it just doesn't happen anymore. Although there has been other weird things going on lately, with Oslo and with Copenhagen, and drones, short-range drones coming from somewhere, although just recently, remarkably, the French seized a ship that had sailed out of Denmark heading down the coast, and drones had turned up over one of their military bases on the coast. So their team showed up with vigor, brought the ship into shore, thoroughly interrogated, and then quietly let them go. So I wonder if the drone story's over now, because I think we're demonstrating lack of a sense of humor around this entire set of behaviors. We've got more regions to concern ourselves with, right? Recently, in the Taiwanese Strait, so that's the little strip of water between Taiwan and China, there's a small island in there called Matsu Island, and those cables were mysteriously cut by an anchor drag. There hasn't been a lot of news about this. The Chinese aren't talking, and the Taiwanese aren't talking, but in the submarine cable industry, there was a conversation about this appears to match the same pattern. There's now repair teams working on those cables. It'll be a few months. That was just earlier this year. So this area south of Taiwan, the Luzon Strait, which is actually quite deep water, is very, very active space. And there's a lot of concern about China's attitudes towards Taiwan. I think the bottom of the Taiwanese Strait right now is probably pretty interesting. I wanted to talk about an event that happened a couple of years ago, because we've built this cable system to be fairly redundant. We talk about loss of performance, but we never really talk about a real impact. Like, what if we really had the cable system attacked in a meaningful way, truly weaponized? And we're lucky that we have an example, and it happened in 22. In January of 22, Hungatonga Ha'apai erupted. This is a volcanic island near the island, the country of Tonga. It was one of the most powerful eruptions that has occurred in several decades. Pinatubo was the only recent one in 1991 that even comes close. Because it was a partially underwater volcano, as the eruption started, the ocean rushed in and created a monstrous flash steam explosion, so loud that it echoed around the planet 3 times. We could measure the compression wave. It kicked off a tsunami that created warnings as far as Japan, New Zealand, and the US. A 20-meter wave hit Tonga itself. It also blew the cable that connected Tonga to the rest of the world. There was only one. Now, we didn't know that at the time. What we did know is there was a massive eruption, and on Tonga, all the cell phones stopped working. There was no internet connection. They just went silent. And of course, then the tsunami arrived. And now you're trying to find out across this island chain nation, who's alive and who's dead, and no communication systems work at all. So they get in their boats and they're running around trying to find people. Unfortunately, very few died. If there'd been a need for a lot of rescuing without communications, that's really tough to coordinate. And at that point, they still don't know what's wrong, just that everything stopped working all at once. The government emergency officials eventually remember that they have a satellite phone. So they go find the satellite phone, then they find out the subscription is expired, and all they need to do to get it working again is to get online and renew it. So it takes them 4 days to find a way to get that to work, and they finally it was 4 days before the first communications got out of Tonga to say, hey, no, we got hit by the tsunami, there's a few people dead, we could use some help. All the cell phones went dead because they didn't know this at the time, but there's no registration center on the islands of Tonga at all. All registration was being done back in Japan under the Undersea cable network. So every single time a phone negotiated with a tower, it did that, which means the phones need to renegotiate with towers roughly every 4 minutes. So they had about 4 minutes before all the phones quit. So there's an upgrade for Tonga. Is you should probably have a registration center on the island, so at least the phones would keep working between each other. But it also took out all banking. So they were working from pen and paper. Some of the islands had shops, but there was no banking center in any of them, so those shops would literally keep hand records of what was going on, and once a day someone would come and collect those papers and bring it back to the main thing, and they logged the whole thing by hand until they could actually figured out that not only was the cable broken, 100 kilometers of it was missing. So they had to have new cable made and then bring the ships in. It took 6 months. In the meantime, our friend Elon showed up with 100 Starlinks, so they used those. As soon as they got the cable patched, then he wanted to charge for them. And the connections between the smaller islands took longer than that, more than a year to kind of connect it together. But it just reminded everyone in Tonga, and I hope reminded all of us, we depend on these cables. Our society functions on it. And most countries, much less most cities, have never tested what would happen in your area, what resources would you still have? The cell phone one's the particularly frightening one. We have to work on making cell phone networks more resilient under these circumstances. In the US after 9/11, they passed a set of laws to allow cell phones to be pinged even without the network working. They actually have these portable towers that would stand up, because where you find a phone, you usually find a person that needs help. And so you need those to work immediately. And we just haven't done enough work in that area. We kind of take it for granted that things are going to keep working. No network infrastructure has a failover solution that works if it's never been tested. You just have to test them, and we haven't done this. So we have a danger, and we've had a clear reminder we can get better at it. Another kind of cable that's around the ocean in certain places are hydrophone networks. This is mostly a Cold War relic. It started in the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, where the Americans paid, with support from NATO, to lay a set of hydrophones across those spaces to track Soviet submarines. Their plan, which they did throughout the Cold War, was that every single time a Soviet submarine transits that gap, an American submarine was right behind it, all of the time, because the Americans have that kind of money. But their whole point was, should the big banner go down and there's going to be a nuclear war, all Soviet subs would explode in the same time. And so they built out this infrastructure to track them all the time. They also put it down the eastern seaboard and the west coast of the United States as well. Just arrays of hydrophones floating on the bottom. They look sort of like this. They have an anchor, controllers, a float so they can be put to the surface if they need to, and then a set of hydrophones in between. They're different levels inside of the water because the water stratifies and sounds transmit at different rates at different levels. And so they covered them all. It's largely been a completely secret network. We've never known much about it. One of the few photos we have of one of the arrays was a unit that washed ashore in Iceland one day and ended up on Reddit. This was the array that detected the Titan submersible implosion. If you remember, a few days after the accident, they suddenly said, oh, we heard the implosion. It was this array that detected it, the SOSUS array. And they now occasionally lease it out to whale scientists and things because it can track marine mammal movement fairly accurately. So we have some interesting things under the water, and those are the ones we know about. You know, up until recently, we've been marking all these cables on maps with the intent for mariners to stay away from them. But the military's never done that. So we really don't know how many military cables are out there. And there's now a discussion going on about whether or not commercial cables should actually be marked out anymore. Just because, for what? Like, what does it benefit us? We're going to bury it deeper, so you're less likely to hit it in the shore if you're not looking for it. And you don't really know where it is the rest of the time. I mentioned that Denant cable from Google, the 240 terabit cable. When that cable was laid in 2000, it carried as much data as every cable laid in 1990. We've gotten better and better with better lasers and better controllers to increase multiplexing. We've been able to shrink the optical repeaters now that was only a 12-strand cable. We're now talking about 24 and 48-strand cables, literally petabit per wire. So mostly it's the tech giants that are laying down these cables. They do put them into the commercial market after they finish them. So Google's not the only one using the Denant cable. They've leased it out into the overall system so that they can move their own traffic over the other cables and others can move over their cables. So when cables get damaged, they kind of cooperate that way. But the telcos these days are not laying fiber as rapidly as the tech giants are. So that's what's building out our infrastructure, for better or worse. We can talk about the consequences of half a dozen companies controlling major infrastructure for a whole civilization. I may have mentioned some of that earlier today. My goal with this talk, and I hoped it brought you there, is just sort of have a sense of how important this network is and how big it is. Now with the ice packs being much smaller in the Arctic, they're now talking about laying fibers from Europe to Japan over the pole. It's practical, it's feasible, not for good reasons, it just is, so we can take advantage of it while we can. So we're going to create more connections. There originally was a negotiation going on between Finland and Russia to do a trans-Arctic cable. They're not talking a lot these days, so that cable's probably going to be on hold. But as we put in data centers, I don't know if you noticed, we put in a lot of data centers, we need the bandwidth to connect them up, and these are the kind of cables that are going to do it. I hope this was useful for you. Thank you very much for your time.